it's really a pleasure to be with you, because I think you're one of the main representatives, the intellectual scene and everything that has to do with politics, values, and also on analysis, so which is something we're lacking. And well, let's start. I think we can start with the words that were spoken by a veteran French political scientist, Yves Meny. Maybe you came to know him, when he was giving a lecture on populism, and he started saying, well, I have good news and bad news. The bad news are that democracy is in crisis. The good news are democracy has always been in crisis. So maybe the first question would be, and you don't have to answer it into detail, because we can go back and forth. So what do you think are the main features of the crisis of democracy nowadays? Because I went to your lecture in Madrid recently at the Fundación, and I remember you were very worried about, what you called democracy in the ballot box. Yeah. So somehow this idea that so the actors, the main political actors, think that the opponent is a danger to democracy, and that brings it home.
Yes. Well, I think first of all, it is true that democracy is permanently in crisis, in the sense that democracy is the system we use to regulate our differences, and our differences of class, differences of gender, differences of region, differences of national identity are often very severe. So at any given moment, we may all be asking, how does democracy manage to deal with these problems? And I think it's important to acknowledge that democracy is in permanent crisis, because there are always people who say, I'm tired of the argument. I'm tired of parliamentary haggling and bargaining. I wish these politicians would shut up and we would have order. The minute you get tired of democracy, you're going in a place that is actually very dangerous to democracy. So let's start with that. But there are moments when the crisis becomes acute. And I think everyone around the world understood what happened when the Capitol was invaded on January the 6th, 2021. And everybody understood that a president who could have said, stop this now, didn't say, stop it now. And he refused to concede the results of an election. At that point, the endemic crisis of democracy becomes critical to the future of democracy itself, because the frame here is losers have to accept they've lost the election. That's the key rule in a democracy. And when a loser refuses to lose, you are close to the abyss. And I think American democracy was close to the abyss in January the 6th. And I'm afraid that we're doing this interview a couple of weeks short of the election. We simply don't know what the result will be. It may take several weeks before we know, because it's going to be very close. And because American democracy is so influential, it influences the health of democracy all over the world. And so I think we have reason to be worried at the moment.
Yeah, but look, I think there's a paradox, when we think about the crisis as we see it nowadays, so which is that we're afraid of what the people, right, is going to vote, which I don't recall it happening before. I mean, at least in my lifetime, right? Yeah. So this is paradoxical, because democracy is supposed to be the rule of the people. So why should we fear it, right?
Yes. Well, there's a long liberal tradition of the 19th century that was fearful of the people.
Yeah.
One of my heroes is Alexis de Tocqueville.
but that was elite democracy somehow. So
And because these were people who'd seen the French Revolution, who'd seen the terror, who'd seen the people leading or being led towards brutal forms of violence. So their sense of democracy was, yes, the people should rule, but there must be checks on popular sovereignty. And I'm of that tradition. I don't believe democracy is majority rule. I teach my students that democracy is power, checking power, to keep the people free. And so the rule of law is integral to democracy. Checks and balances are integral to democracy. Constitutional law is integral to democracy. A free media is integral to democracy. Because I think, unfashionable as it is to say it, sometimes the people are dangerous when they're led by demagogues and fools, and so de Tocqueville wasn't wrong here, and a liberal believes that popular sovereignty has to be balanced, and when it's balanced and when these institutions work well, people are free. But at every moment, this is a conflictual situation. That is, at every moment, a prime minister, and I think this may be familiar to Spanish viewers, will be saying the judges have no business doing X. And the judges are saying, excuse me, the prime minister has no business doing X. And so this conflictual relationship is essential to democratic freedom. Hopefully, when that balance is ultimately respected, when the prime minister respects the judiciary and the judiciary respects the authority of the prime minister, then you have freedom for Spaniards. When that balance is overturned, you have a situation of danger.
yeah, that's exactly what we can frame as popular sovereignty versus the rules of the rules of law,
Yeah.
right? So, but it's every day. We see that conflict every day, and now in a more tragical way. Let's take the last example. An Italian court rules that Meloni should have sent, those asylum seekers to Albania, right? So, which is the typical conflict between a majority rule and the rule of law, right? And we can see it everywhere. In the case of Spain, with the amnesty for the Catalan. And with the Catalan issue, and in Germany nowadays, because there are lots of groups demanding that the Constitutional Court makes the Alternative für Deutschland illegal.
Yes.
Right, because it's a militant constitution. So in that sense, but. I don't think there's an a priori solution to that problem. So we can go back. I mean, this is the debate between Kelsen and Carl Schmitt during the Weimar Republic, right? So we're going back and forth. We keep returning to something which democratic theory hasn't really solved, except, as you said, the liberals. But the problem is that the liberals tend to be a minority.
Oh, sure.
And the majority is more,
and
more populistic.
And one of the dangers in this whole debate is when a populist authoritarian says of the judiciary, says of the media, says of all of his opponents, this is the elite.
Yeah, exactly.
So they reframe the constitutional balance between the rule of law and the executive as a battle between the people and a spoiled, corrupted, entitled elite who do not have the people's interests at heart. And so they redefine this constitutional cleavage as a social cleavage, and essentially start getting the people to think judges are just a spoiled bunch of corrupt people who drive around in fancy cars and are thwarting the just will of the people. Trump is a virtuoso at that. In the European context, Orban is a virtuoso at saying, I represent the sturdy, honest people of Hungary against the elite, entitled, corrupted bureaucrats in Brussels who are trying to thwart the popular will. And so he recasts this, the role of Brussels, which is to serve as a countervailing power in Europe, to balance the European political system so that national states don't go off the democratic rails. That's what Brussels is supposed to do. He recasts that as the battle between the ordinary people and privileged, spoiled bureaucrats pulling down big salaries in Brussels. And this, again, is standard political practice. Let's not get hysterical about it, but it's not good for democratic freedom. The judges are not simply elite, spoiled, corrupted people. They are representatives of a thing called the law, right? And we need to understand that. And I think there's a lot of popular understanding that the law matters. But we have to be at home with something that I think is difficult for us to be at home with, which is that there's the Constitution, there's the law, and then there's politics. And politics is a rough, tumble, brutal business in which each side plays with these meanings and tries to force their understanding upon it. And it's a mistake for liberals like me to think there's only one possible meaning of this. It's the liberal meaning. Forget about it. In politics, it's much rougher than that. And that's something I learned from being in politics.
I know. I wanted to go back to your experience, but we'll talk about it later on. But you know, what interests me and what worries me regarding this new populist movements in Europe is that they tend to look at the rear mirror, right? So they want to go back to the nation state. They want to go back to ethnically cohesive societies, and they don't want to enter into what we may say supranational, and they don't want to enter into the supranational dimension of politics. So Europe should be in order to defend their nation states, yes, not the new, this more cosmopolitan conception of Europe as being the holder of universalistic rights. So it's more important, the dimension of belonging than the dimension of universalism. I mean, this Kantian view of politics, but it has several implications. So first, and I think here your Canadian experience might help us Europeans to understand the issue. The main reason for which they get the votes is immigration. Mm-hmm, sure. I mean, that's it appears in all the polls and all the studies, regarding the votes on these parties, and then it's also the geopolitical dimension, because they want to make peace with Russia. They want to even incorporate Russia because they know they share the values of Putin. This new leader, Sara Wagenknecht, which is so a leftist populist, which is at the same time pro-Russian on the one hand, on the other hand against migrations, and so it's a mix. Yeah. So it may have enormous implications for the European Union as something new, something that tries to introduce a new understanding of global cooperation. So if you want, we can split both issues. Immigration on the one hand and democracy and diversity, which I think it's an important issue, the Canadian experience, because I know you're much more developed than we are, and then the more geopolitical dimension of him. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. I think you put the question very well. It's very difficult to separate these things. Migration is not just an issue about foreigners coming from Africa and Asia to Spain. It's about the national identity of Spain.
Yeah, totally.
It's about who we are. We too easily assume that anybody who's worried about migration into Spain is a racist. Not necessarily. Sometimes the question is, who are we? Do we have a common set of rules and cultural standards in our country anymore? So I've always thought that the liberal response, I'm in favor of migration. My name is Ignatieff. I'm the descendant of refugees who came to Canada. I have to believe in migration. It's where it's
exactly
made my life possible. But we need to stop pointing our fingers at people who are worried about migration, because illegal migration, I think, threatens the rule of law. Illegal migration is a cancer because it encourages the exploitation of illegal migrants in our country, prevents them becoming equal citizens. So I've always been in favor, and the Canadian model has always been, we want lots of migration, but we don't want any illegal migration. And that means if you don't want illegal migration, you have to have tough border control. And you have to send people back, and that's the most painful aspect. But I don't think you can have a political contract in favor of migration unless you have a very tough policy against illegal migration. So that's one thing I think. But you made a point earlier, which I think is also very valid, which is a lot of the populist attack on the multicultural society we've created since the 1960s is a kind of reactionary nostalgia for a world that has passed and will never come back. And this reactionary nostalgia is everywhere. On those baseball caps that Mr. Trump throws out in the crowd, it says, "Make America Great Again," as if there's some lost moment in which America dominated the world and told everybody to shut up, and that's the America we want. And that America is gone forever simply because of the rise of China, simply because of the rise of the BRICS, simply because the world is totally different geopolitically than it was when I was a young man and when Trump was a young man. And that reactionary nostalgia is having devastating political effects throughout Europe. Mr. Wilders in the Netherlands wants to take the Netherlands back to a society that disappeared in the 1950s. Mr. Orban wants to have a Hungary in which there are only Hungarians.
That never existed, by the way.
Which never existed because Hungary has always been a multicultural, multi-ethnic society. I'm married to a Hungarian, so I know a little bit about this. So this kind of reactionary nostalgia is politically dangerous because it leads people to have expectations that the political system can't deliver. Yeah. I mean, what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to throw out of the Netherlands or out of Spain or out of Hungary every single person who's not Spanish by birth, Dutch by birth, Hungarian by birth. We can't do that, and we wouldn't want to. I think it's very important to remember we wouldn't want to. Our societies are cultural diversity and pluralism wasn't some terrible mistake. I mean, if you just think about the COVID vaccine and you think about who develops the key commercialization of RNA vaccines in 2019, it's a Turkish couple, migrants to Germany, who produce, we can repeat these stories endlessly. The contribution of people who come from elsewhere to our countries is just incredible. But the thing that I think the liberal side has failed to understand has been how upsetting, how convulsive the coming of a multicultural society has been. We've witnessed since the 1960s what could be called a revolution of inclusion. It's not just migration, it's feminism. The explosive development of women's rights, which has transformed our families. Gay rights, which has transformed our idea of sexual identity. All of these put together have changed the society more than anything else. And it's a revolution that has threatened whites without college education.
Exactly. Yeah.
And they're right to be threatened, to feel threatened, because this society promotes diversity, promotes women, promotes sexual minorities. And so they feel often left out and excluded. And the revolution of inclusion coincided with a revolution of education. I don't know what the figures are for Spain in 1960, but I know in other European societies, something like 3, 4, 5% of the population had university degrees. Now it's 30, 40%.
40% even.
And we think that's terrific, but we forget the 60% who still don't have a college degree. And to the degree that a college degree is the key to social ascent, if you don't have it, you feel suddenly left out, and you feel all the people who have college degrees, who have different skin colors or different genders or different sexual orientations, are getting ahead of you. And so it produces enormous amount of social tension in our society. And populism appeals to those who feel they've been left out and excluded. And at a minimum, a society that wants to be at peace with each other has to listen to those who are left out as well as those who've been included. And we haven't. As a liberal, I don't think we've listened carefully enough to the resentment and bitterness and struggle of those who have been left behind.
Yeah, but look, this touches upon the idea of common values, right? So, because what we thought were untransformable principles, universal principles, they would be there forever, and so they're being questions nowadays, and this idea of this new particularisms have appeared, particularly in the woke ideology, the so-called woke ideology, right? So the idea that, the universalism doesn't help in order to fight in political issues. So we need to stick to identities. So we are within several identity blocks, that are somehow existentially designed to be in conflict with each other, and that creates a reaction on part of the old traditional values that say, so what about us? So,
yes.
Like for instance, okay, let's be incredibly tolerant towards Islamists within our societies, but what happens with the Catholics?
Sure.
What happens with the evangelists? So,
Absolutely. But, and the revolution of inclusion, the liberal revolution, resulted in something we didn't expect at all, which is the constituencies that made the revolution then broke apart into different separate identities. Mm-hmm. Feminism, gay rights, Black Lives Matter, and on and on. So suddenly you get, instead of a universal political, a political alliance based on universal values, what we share, you begin to have a politics which says, you can't understand me unless you're black. You can't understand me unless you're a woman.
Exactly.
You can't understand me unless you're... And so we have this kind of epistemological closure which has broken apart the liberal consensus.
Yeah.
And so, and then in addition to that, you can't understand me if you're not Hungarian. Yeah. You can't understand me if you weren't born in Spain. You can't understand me if you weren't born Dutch. and this particularism is supporting. And again, I don't think. I know it sounds complacent, but I feel this reaction is to be expected and inevitable. Why? Because I actually think universalism is a thought experiment which contradicts our daily experience.
Yeah.
That is, when we're out in the world, we don't see human beings. We see a Spaniard. We see a man of a certain age. I look across the room. I see a woman. I see a person of color.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so our actual experience of life is of difference, not of the universal and the shared. And this is said to you by someone who teaches human rights and has spent his whole life trying to persuade my students to see the universal. But it's a thought experiment. It requires effort. And sometimes you have to have catastrophe before the universal returns. So we have human rights because of the Holocaust. Yeah. We have human rights because we saw what would happen if the principle of difference, national, racial, religious, prevails over what we have in common. I hope we don't have to have a catastrophe again to remind us why the universal is essential principle of politics.
But then again, and then returning to the more geopolitical dimension, there's this other distinction between, the Weberian distinction between the ethics of responsibility and the ethics of conviction, right? So, and we keep constantly referring to one or the other depending on the situation. I mean, the migrant situation, particularly the asylum right, which might be restricted, as you know, all over Europe. So, which is that lies in the very near future, probably. So, it belongs clearly into the idea of the ethics of conviction. But on the other hand, we, regarding populism nowadays, if you see how von der Leyen, is moving, we have the impression that, there's a danger called populism, and I think she really believes in that.
Yeah.
But, so we have to be cautious, and we have to think of the consequences. If they come to power everywhere, if they become majoritarian, this will be the end. So we have to make certain concessions, particularly in the case of migration, probably also in foreign policy, and we can go back to the case of Russia, and so let's give in on these issues in order to avoid greater evil, right? And so but on the other hand, when you give in, you're being a traitor, regarding your ethics of conviction. And I think we're constantly balancing, one with the other. And so in a certain way, people who come from the left, who do believe in human rights, have always had this universalist discourse, suddenly find themselves, with this new realism, that starts spreading all over, not just in the United States, of course, but also in Europe. So and this coincides as well with something which is maybe civilizational. I mean, our identity was based on those common universalist values. And suddenly when they break up, so who are we? We go again to that question. We as a civilization now, as the West, right? So if we return to our nation states or our nations, to give it a more identitarian twist, then it's the end of the Enlightenment project. So don't you think that there's a danger, to...
The danger is that by conceding too much to the populist right, to the identitarian right, we sacrifice the convictions that sustained European civilization. Yeah, it's a very powerful argument. I'm an ethics of responsibility guy.
Me too, by the way.
Using Weber's language.
Yeah.
And having been in politics, I've come out with a much greater respect for the political, the necessity to tack this way and that way to keep possibilities alive. And as Weber said, there are ways in which you can tack and go this way and that way that end up betraying your convictions, and that's what you're worried about, and I certainly agree. I think your characterization of von der Leyen is right. I think everybody is moving a little bit to the right. Even my earlier answer 15 minutes ago in this conversation about migration indicates that I think illegal migration is something that liberals have been very slow to understand how destructive that is of the rule of law and how destructive it is of the political consensus that sustains migration. So we're all tacking a little bit, and we mustn't lose ultimate conviction. I think there are bigger issues here. One thing that I think will potentially stiffen our resolve to defend European values, and I hope we'll stiffen it before it's too late, is what Putin is doing in Ukraine. That is, sometimes we need to see the enemy. You know, I'm of Russian heritage, so I have deep...
Russian and Ukrainian, both, right?
Yes, Russian and Ukrainian. I have deep love and respect and affection for Russian culture. Yeah. But this regime represents just about everything that European civilization has good reason to detest. You can call it fascist, you can call it whatever you want, but it's violating the UN Charter, it's violating every tenet of international law, it's engaged in wholesale slaughter of a population who want essentially to be free Europeans. I mean, it's perfectly clear what's going on here. And so when AfD and Sarah Wagenknecht and all these people and Orban get cozy with the Russians, I think it reveals just how endangered the European project is. If you cannot understand what Putin represents, if you cannot understand that this represents the antithesis of what Europe is supposed to believe and stand for, we really have a breakdown in the core European commitments. And that's been going on for a long time. I spent a lot of time in Hungary. I was the rector of a university that got thrown out of Hungary by Viktor Orban in the worst attack on academic freedom since the 1930s. So this man has been in the business of consolidating single-party authoritarian rule for 14 years, and Europe has done effectively nothing about it. Now, if this keeps going, first Hungary, then Slovakia, then possibly Poland going backwards again, then 2027 Marine Le Pen winning in France.
Which might happen, by the way.
Then you are looking at the collapse of the European project. There's no doubt in my mind you're either a union of democracies committed to the rule of law, international law, the defense of the UN Charter, the defense of democracy inside. You either believe that, or because Europe is not just an economic project. It's not just a common market. It's a set of commitments. Sure. And so I think there are good reasons to be genuinely alarmed about this. And when you wake up in time, you can stop this. But Europe needs to wake up.
Yeah, not just this double standard regarding the Western position vis-a-vis what's happening in the Ukraine and what's happening now in the Middle East, the Gaza and war, because that's that's at least the perception on part of the global South. What we have to go.
Yes. Yes. Europe has a historic relationship and commitment to the State of Israel. So many people in Israel are descended from or emigrated from a Europe that had tormented them, persecuted them, sent them to the gas chambers. So Europe has this historic relationship to Israel. It's part of me. I've lived in Israel, taught in Israel, lectured in Israel. I'm appalled when European universities say we should sever our relations with Israeli universities, because for God's sake, they're the only free institutions in the whole region. But having said that, since I first went to Israel in 1988, I've been a passionate believer in two states for two peoples. Yeah. And I know hundreds of Israelis who believe the same. Exactly. And who believe not just that two states for two peoples is the right political solution, but who believe much more importantly that the occupation of the West Bank is a poison which will destroy Israeli democracy. Yeah, that is, Palestinian statehood is not just something for the Palestinians. Palestinian statehood is necessary to save the Zionist project, which is democracy in the Middle East. And what's happening in Gaza is a moral catastrophe. I mean, and I think that the horror that is unfolding here is that every day that passes, Israel is creating a new generation of enemies. Yes. True. And as someone who wants Israel to survive, to thrive, to prosper, and to be at peace with its neighbors, Netanyahu's victories look to me like what is called catastrophic success. You know?
Yeah. So let's change the subject, because I think you're well, I read your book when it came out, Fire and Ashes, you know, and I really loved it because it was looking at a political theorist, because I think I'm mainly a political theorist as myself. Getting deep into ordinary politics, and I found the way you explained your experience really fascinating, but I have two questions regarding the issue. One has to do with what's the use of the intellectual, in the political scenery, because we haven't talked about this. It's now called infocalypsis, the social media, disinformation, and so on and so forth, which explains a lot of what's going on, right? We don't have the time, to enter into it, but let's keep it at the background, So what are intellectuals for nowadays, in the public sphere, on the one hand, and on the other hand, something that you said, I think it was in the debate after your lecture in Madrid, we need to change our relationships as opponents, being politicians, we need to get closer to the enemy, to the so-called enemy. And so we need a change of culture in terms of political behavior. So we have to run away from sectarism and even in a phenomenological sense, so you to incorporate the other, right, as being part of the, of your being in politics, that you're not just a member of a party, but you're a member of an institution where there are other parties, and you incorporate them too, right?
Let's start with intellectuals.
Yeah, exactly.
I think one of the interesting social changes in my lifetime was that I've seen the final death of the public intellectual. It's measured in Britain by the fact that from the 1940s right through to the early 1980s, British television would sponsor extremely elaborate intellectual discussions about ideas, and Isaiah Berlin
was one of the key figures. Yeah.
Became a famous public figure in England because he spent a lot of time on British public radio. And I'm sure there were analogies in Spain. That is, you had public intellectuals who, I think we were a transitory, public intellectuals were a transitory phenomenon. Sartre, Camus, the public intellectual in Britain in the 50s, possibly there were analogies in Spain, I don't know. But I think beginning in the 90s, it began to collapse. And I think there's some good reasons for that.
Yeah.
People got tired of us pompous, self-important intellectuals telling people what they ought to think. There was a kind of democratization of knowledge that accompanied the technological revolution that gives us our cell phones. So it's not all negative, but I lived through it. I lived the kind of tail end of it. And I'm now in a social media environment in which my closest friends who are intellectuals are tweeting, posting, doing Substack, running around trying to, create an audience for themselves that has collapsed. So that's an important intellectual phenomenon. But I was called a public intellectual. I actually don't regret the demise of it. I still write the books. I still love doing what I'm doing. I still have some kind of audience. I think we should be much more self-mocking about how important we were. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that I'm an intellectual who went into politics. And you learn very quickly how nice it is to be an intellectual. Yeah, because you're responsible only to yourself and to your discipline and to your sense of the truth. In politics, you're suddenly responsible for a whole institution, a whole thing. And I think one of the difficulties in politics, about an intellectual in politics, is you don't understand that politics is war by other means. Politics is combat. If you had to ask me what I didn't have in politics, it was I didn't know how to give a punch and I didn't know how to take a punch. And the great politicians can take a punch and give one right back. So it's war by other means, but, and this was part of your question, it's war that is not war. It's war with rules. It's
fake war.
It's fake war. And the whole point of politics is to avoid actual war. The reason we care about democracy, the most basic reason, is it keeps us from fighting each other. And so the antagonism of politics has to be very, very carefully managed so it doesn't become violent. And so I've made the distinction between enemies and adversaries. In politics, it's a battle, it should be a battle of adversaries. But an adversary today can become an ally tomorrow. Whereas an enemy can never be anything other than an enemy.
And it's a zero-sum game, yeah.
And our politics is, at the moment, in many countries, the politics of enemies is just short of actual violence. And we should all be concerned about that. We want a politics which is combative, antagonistic, because we disagree, but stays this side of violence, especially in a place like Spain, which has a terrible historical memory. Sure. And especially in the United States.
Two countries, by the way, who had civil wars.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And in some sense, the Civil War is not over in the United States. Yeah. And I hope to God the Civil War is over in your country. But so these are the issues that worry me.
Okay, thank you very much. We don't have much time, but it's been really a pleasure, and we thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.